all had mentors who shaped their formation and leadership in ministry, and they had mentors throughout their entire career. Some of them were near the end, near retirement, and they still had mentors who they met with regularly. Interesting thing is, none of them had official coaches in their ministry at this particular time. They have used coaches in the past, but at this particular time of the research, they did not have a coach, which I found interesting because the paradigm of coaching is so popular now. I bet you with this new generation, maybe coaches will be more prominent, but mentors are critical. And mentor-coach is probably going to be the critical paradigm that we're looking at in the future. They all demonstrated an entrepreneurial trait and behavior. And some had problems with this word entrepreneurial when I raised it. They said, oh, that's a word of the world. And I don't want to engage that. But then when I explained to them my operational definition was immediately seizing on opportunities and avoiding hazards like the plague, they said, yeah, I do that. I mean, they really practice it even though the word was not something they all resonated with. But all of them were entrepreneurial in their core. And the interesting thing was the difference between the high effective and low effective is they immediately seized upon it. Others thought about it, but then they didn't do anything about it, and the opportunity passed very quickly. These folks immediately made the contacts and followed up on the action steps to get the opportunity going. They excelled, of course, in oral and written communication, that's a no-brainer. And they demonstrated a resiliency in their personal ministries. They all had stories about when they failed, and failed badly, and how they were able to use faith as a vehicle to move them forward and really learn from the failure. So as a corollary to this, the question of mentors and resiliency, there was a glass ceiling. All of the women, which are about 40% of my study, mentioned sexism in their ministry. And dealing with sexism, both in a systemic as well as individual way. So it is very clear that sexism is alive and well in our church, and we've got to continue to address this and attack it at whatever levels we encounter it from. And I'm glad to say that we lead the way in our other faith communities in terms of empowerment of women, but we have a ways to go. We all have a ways to go on that one. They also had a personal vision, and that personal vision affected their larger vision of where the church was. Now, interestingly enough, their personal vision wasn't supplanted into the church's vision. They clearly worked with the church for their own vision, but they were able to navigate their personal vision within the sort of structure of where the church needed to go. So there wasn't this sense of intrusion of personal vision into the organization's vision. And they all understood systems theory. Most of them read Harvard Business Review and were up on the latest leadership literature. I found that very striking also. As a corollary to that, the dynamic relationship between faith and leadership development is that they excelled in both spiritual practices, the foundation and well of faith, as well as leadership practices. And what I found is that these two form a synergy for regular practices. So when they showed up, their internal selves had this well of faith as well as an understanding of organizations and leaderships and where they needed to go. So in faith development alone, we know that people are tremendously spiritual but have no clue about organization structures. I don't think they're as effective. Or we have those that are on the edge of leadership development. Faith is kind of shallow. That's not good enough. So both of these seem necessary for high effective leaders as traits. And finally, the situation and context does matter. Where we place people, the demographics, the history, the past leadership, location, all made a difference. And it made a difference not necessarily in vitality, but in sheer numbers. In other words, some of these high effective clergy were able to make huge leaps of worship attendance. That's what we mainly judged on. And it was because their demographics were favorable. Others were making small leaps, and the demographics were a factor in how they were able to be effective. They all grew, but some were not as dramatic as others. And so we realized that the quality of clergy leadership to adapt to the context makes a huge difference in the ultimate success of the local setting or the church itself. All right? So those are a quick way. I know we went too fast with this. We will post these, by the way. But I want to talk a little bit, finally, to wrap this up, about the limitations with competencies. Because if we focus just on competencies, we're sort of in trouble, because competencies are always time and culture bound. And we're struggling with this because we have competencies now on some of your plates that are no longer relevant to the church that we serve. Everything's changed with competencies. Though the general rule of thumb in the literature is that it takes about 10,000 hours to master something. So you start with concentrated, what they call deliberative practice or exercises. And it takes about 5 hours of concentrated focus and practice over a 10-year period to develop a mastery of any particular subject. The problem with it is this analogy is, and research is narrowed to a single discipline or context. For example, chess masters. There's a board and there's chess pieces, and they move in specific ways, but that's it. It has a boundary of the board and the complexity of the movement. Now, it's much deeper than that, but you master one context or boundary. And what we're dealing with is the complexity of the mastery of ministry, which doesn't have a boundary. So I'm struck by Rick Deshawn, who we use in the higher ed research, and some of you are participating in some of his study, who, as a secular researcher, said, I've never seen a job with such fast-paced and varied responsibilities, that he said, we pastors have to go from role to role on an instantaneous basis and be constantly shifting. So he called this multitasking and polychronic orientation, which is a researcher's term to say we're constantly having to change and adapt to whatever role that is called upon us. And we live this daily. I mean, it's schizophrenic for new people. It's schizophrenic for a researcher like Rick to see this. But for us, it's like, oh yeah, we're schizophrenic. That's part of who we are. And we live with that. And you that do it well are able to manage it and instantaneously move. So the mastery involves something more. Because how many of us have put 10,000 hours exclusively on all the roles of ministry? Preaching, counseling, teaching, evangelism. You don't put that much time into any one aspect of what's required of us in the old paradigm. But what I have found, it's not the individual mastery of some of those. Some of you have done that, by the way. You've either studied that or you've gained that, and that's your great strength. But how none of us are able to master every facet of general ministry. It is this integration of the roles, though, that produces the seamless interaction of leadership. The interaction, putting it all together, that these high effective leaders had. And I do want to access one more issue that is not in the dissertation, but I've later come to realize, and that is the truly great leaders have both originality and innovation in their sort of repertoire. High effective clergy who continue to grow and vitalize churches combine mastery and originality as the foundation of their success. They're lifelong learners who continue to master whatever, and they never stop trying to learn about anything. But they're also originators, innovators, experimenters. One without the other will not succeed. And we have to continue to find novel ways even as we seek our mastery. So this particular group is a perfect example. There are probably some masters of ministry. Most of you are there. Some of you are getting there sitting at these tables. And it is fostering the balance between trying to master our craft of ministry, but always remaining on that cutting edge of originality, innovation, and experimentation. So Roger Martin is the secular business guy who just retired from Toronto School of Business that really has written a great deal on this, called The Opposable Mind is his major work on this area. And he reminds us that the great ones do both of these things. They deepen their mastery while continuing their originality. And I like the last line of this. They keep the proverbial trains running, but will never invent the future if you only stop at mastery. And are we keeping the proverbial trains running as masters, but not then taking the next step of the experimentation and innovation that the church has to have as we're in this transition period? Amy Edmondson, writer of Harvard Business Review, often says, and let me read this because it's so helpful, our natural tendencies, the way we are hardwired, will lead us to favor mastery over originality, will lead us to keep going in the direction we are going and try to improve marginally around the edges on what we've already done. In so doing, we utterly miss opportunities to make a big difference, something brand new and exciting. So I think that that's really true, that we can go into our silo of mastery and become really an individual expert in ministry. But what we're lacking then is what we need right now, which is what's the turn that's going to enable this whole church, the Church of Jesus Christ in the United Methodist context, to really be some dynamic presence in making disciples and transforming the world. It's here in this room, and we just got to find that. So the innovation diagram is if the goal is too large, if we do try to end world hunger, where do you start? Well, it needs collaborative impact. But if the goal is too small, file today's paperwork, it's just not worth it. It's a question of relevancy. And what we've got to find is that sweet spot in between these two, the relevant and the impactful, that's really going to make a difference. And I'm counting on all of you to be part of that in your work and for the work of the Church of Jesus Christ. It's more than just us that's at stake here. So let me advocate one last thing, and that is bootlegging time. 3M pioneered this concept, and Google and many others are using it, where 20% of the working time of any researcher, or oftentimes any director, can be spent on any topic of passion or interest that they have. So it's their own time that they're paid for to find these things out. But it's structured accountability. There are some rules. You can't just go off on your own and say, I'm going to research this subject and really look into it. You've got to report it. You've got to meet with other collaborators who will expand upon your ideas and take you in a new direction. And you need to cross-pollinate with others in other areas of the company, such as the engineers get together with the human relation folks, the R&D gets together with marketing. And it's in that cross-pollination that the greatest innovations are starting to come out. So we need to take seriously how we're going to do this. One is you all need 20% of your working time in this originality and innovation. And as a bishop, I give you permission, if you're in my area, to take the 20%. I can't say that for every area, so you got to go back to your own leadership and do that. But I think my colleagues would really support this, that really give you permission to start thinking and researching and following your passions about originality. And then I just want to get one, it's like, how do we put in all this? One final takeaway of things that we're currently learning. We're starting a Toole Center of Leadership after Bishop Jack Toole and Marjorie Toole. And this is one thing that we're learning in our research. And it's really from the positive deviance research. Richard Pascal is the main guy on this area. It's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting. Now, this is really important for us because our old paradigm has focused on clergy education and feeding their minds only, and not holding them accountable to the practice. And this focuses on practice rather than knowledge in order to really leverage change of any organization. So the positive deviance is to look for what really works, find out and train people in what works, and then set them loose. The old paradigm of us gathering people for ministry immersions, presentations by people like me and others who will kind of feed your mind, and then sending them out, just not working. And I have a colleague at Pepperdine who's he's a Boeing high exec, and he was with their state-of-the-art research center. It was a executive center that Boeing built. Now, they were so embarrassed by his results, he couldn't use Boeing name in the dissertation, by the way. So he says a major aerospace company in his dissertation. He found out that this state-of-the-art executive center really didn't help anybody. They'd bring in Collins and Heifetz and all these high name, and people would get all jazzed up, and then they'd go back, and within about a month, they'd go back to their regular practices and nothing changed. And within 6 months, made absolutely no difference. So this is what I'm talking about, the paradigm that we're even struggling with in the secular world on this issue. Feeding people's minds does not make them change, does not make them show up any differently, is what we're finding. And so what I think is important for us now to think about is to couple this focus on behaviors, practices, with a performance coach who holds the person accountable, and this is proving to be much more successful in our work. So you have accountability and you have practice, and if you want to read on habits, which Duhigg on habit is the latest book, but there's a whole bunch of literature around how you make things habitual, might be the key to us having our rank and file becoming more effective.